Baldur's Gate 3 does a lot of things right. I think the combat system is both complicated and yet not overwhelming. I think there's a good build variety, and everyone that plays gets to feel like their character is really their own. The story is really fun to watch unfold, even on subsequent playthroughs, but I'd argue that the thing it does best is create compelling, interesting, and likable companions. I like them so much that I've gone as far as to download mods that increase the limit of folks I can have in my party just so I can talk to them at all times and not miss any interactions between them. That being said though, there's a funny thing I hear from time to time from people that play the game. They'll say things along the lines of, hey, if Wyll is the legendary Blade of Frontiers, then why is he a level 1 warlock? If Karlach fought in the Blood War, then how come she can barely hold her own when we meet her? And the answer to those sorts of questions is pretty clear, because it's a video game. Duh. They can't just throw all the companions in there at max strength, then we wouldn't get to build a party and level up as we go. The in-game explanation also kinda helps the because it's a video game answer by explaining that the tadpole that we've been infected with at the start of the game is making ourselves and our companions weaker. As we go through Baldur's Gate 3 and gain strength though, we can get our companions back to their former glory, or at least pretty close. But that begs the question, what was their former glory? We know lots of the companions' backstories, but do we know just how powerful they really were? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this question has been on my mind as of late, and to answer it, I not only played through the game a few more times, totally for research purposes, not because I'm addicted, but that didn't feel like enough to make a definitive list. So I continued my research by watching YouTube videos, reading the companions' wiki pages, and reading every single line of dialogue involving the companions. Oh, yeah, no, I'm not kidding. Every single word spoken from, to, or about the companions I have read. It was a lot. That being said, I'm feeling pretty good about the list I've compiled here, and I'm gonna take you through that list of companions from weakest to the strongest, based on a lore standpoint before the events of the game. To be clear though, I'm just gonna stick with the 6 origin companions. Things get a little messy with the other guys because people like Jaheira in Minsk should be like pretty much unstoppable, but if you've ever been through that Moonrise Towers battle, you'll learn full well that Jaheira is very stoppable. I think you get my point. There's more solid information out there and in the game for the original 6, so I'm only going to touch on them. As we go, feel free to disagree with me, but if you do, all I ask is that you tell me why. I hate comments that just say, no, you're wrong, and then they don't explain any further. And if you enjoy listening to videos like this, or want to take pity on me because I read thousands of lines of dialogue, then you should subscribe. My eyes hurt. Alright, enough stalling, it's lore time. Oh, and spoiler warning, of course. So someone has to be at the bottom, and I want to make it very clear right away that this doesn't mean this person is weak. It just means that in a pretty wildly differing list of strongest companions, they just have the least advantages and the most disadvantages. That being said, in last place we have everyone's favorite vampire, Astarion. Astarion is a character we meet very early on in Baldur's Gate 3, and from the get-go he's pretty closed off about his past. To be frank though, he does a pretty horrible job of hiding the fact that he's a vampire. He is though, as he admits himself, not a true vampire. Astarion is what's known as a vampire spawn, and because of that, I'm sure some of you guys are confused about why he's on the bottom. You see, in D&D, vampire spawns are fairly formidable creatures, sporting a challenge rating of 5, a rating right alongside Cambions, hill giants, and unicorns. Yup, you heard me. Unicorns. The problem with using the challenge rating of your average vampire spawn for Astarion's case is that Astarion isn't your average vampire spawn. He's much weaker. In several ways, either through his given exposition or a literal dive into his head, we get to see that Astarion has been through it. For those who aren't familiar, Astarion was once a magistrate in the city of Baldur's Gate. One night though, he was jumped by a group of Gur who weren't too happy about a ruling he had passed down. They beat him right up to death's door, but instead of the Grim Reaper sweeping him away, he suffered a fate much worse. He was found by a man named Cazador Zar. Cazador, as we'll come to find out, is a vampire lord, a vampire of near fully realized potential. So, with a bite from Cazador, Astarion was brought back from the brink and right into Cazador's service. Life under Cazador was, pardon my French here, fucking awful. Astarion was constantly starved, tortured, and abused beyond the limits of what a creature should even be capable of suffering, but he was capable, eternal life and all. To give you an example, Cazador once locked Astarion in a tomb with no food, no rats, no bugs, and no company for an entire year. And that was just in Astarion's first decade under Cazador's thumb. It gets even worse for him though, because he goes on to tell us that Cazador grew a sort of obsession for our pale elf. Cazador told Astarion that his screams sounded sweetest. Astarion was abused in these ways for over 200 years, only occasionally being fed those rats and bugs. His only release was when he was able to go into the city, where he'd be tasked to lure people back to the palace, where Cazador would take the fates of those poor souls from there. And you know what? There's not really a happy ending for Astarion until the events of the game's main story begins, when he's whisked away by mind flayers. I mean, imagine that. You live a life of fear and torture, and the best thing that could happen to you is being kidnapped by Squidward. It was a truly dreadful existence. But what can we say about Astarion in terms of strength? Because remember, that's what we're talking about here. Let's start with the things working in Astarion's favor. Like I mentioned, Astarion is a vampire spawn, which does give him some upsides. He has a vampiric bite and an affinity for the shadows. We also could compare Astarion to another vampire spawn in Baldur's Gate 3, a character we meet in the third act, Petros. Petros is Astarion's vampire brother, as they were both brought under Cazador's wing and tortured in the same ways. When we meet him, Petros has some pretty solid stats. He's level 11 and boasts over 100 HP. So if we wanted to find a general range for Astarion's former strength, you'd think that this might be where he falls, which should definitely mean he's not in last place on our list. The problem is, Astarion is considerably weaker than Petros. That can be proved by simply looking at their respective vampiric abilities. Petros has a bite that deals necrotic damage, a multi-attack, and access to the vampire regeneration feature. Astarion, on the other hand, doesn't have any of that. His bite deals some piercing damage, and that's it. Now, I think most people would say Astarion obviously doesn't have these abilities when we meet him because of the Tadpole, or more honestly, for gameplay reasons. I mean, if he could do all that, he'd be pretty dang tough. But I don't think that's entirely true. We know for a fact that Astarion can still drink blood like a normal vampire, and he gains the happy condition anytime he does it. So it's not like his vampire abilities are totally on hold. Personally, I feel like there's a few things at play here. First of all, I think Astarion was simply just abused and pushed further than the other spawn were. As Astarion says, he had felt so little for so long over those years rotting in the kennels. And while the other spawn have obviously also been abused, none of them use this same kind of extreme language. They also don't seem as keen on escaping Cazador's grasp like Astarion does, so I can only assume that things were either just worse for him, or Cazador has the other spawn more brainwashed. Either way, the energy between Astarion and his siblings feels different. It doesn't feel like they were, as Astarion puts it, rotting. A vampire can grow incredibly powerful, not even just through the rite of profane ascension, but also just by consuming people's blood like regularly. At some point in our playthrough, Astarion says, "Now that I'm well fed, I'm more capable than ever," which leads me to believe that when he was being starved, like he was before we meet him, he was much weaker. Not to mention that the poor guy doesn't even really have agency over his own body. He was basically a sock puppet for Cazador, so who knows if Astarion would have, at that time at least, even known what to do with his body in a fight. And then of course come the downsides of being a vampire. Water is like acid, can't go into people's homes unless invited, and the biggest one, the sun. This all goes to say that while I think Astarion is the weakest of the six, the odds are stacked against him at an inconceivable level. He most certainly has the saddest backstory, and those circumstances unfortunately place him at the bottom for this list. But there's something kind of beautiful that he says later in the game that does make me feel better about his new outlook on life.
This little adventure of ours has taught me that we can't let our lives be ruled by fear, or else we never really live.
When I began doing research for this video, I assumed a lot of things. I assumed Karlach and Wyll were going to be tied for the strongest companions, I assumed Shadowheart was definitely the weakest, and I assumed that Lae'zel was much stronger than she actually is. Lae'zel of Kresh Kalir is a different sort of tragedy than the one we just discussed. I'll just start by saying this. Githyanki got it rough, man. They are a brutal, cutthroat race of people who value strength and might above all else. Well, not above their devotion to Vlaakith, their queen. queen. Lae'zel is no different when we meet her. She seeks to snuff out any weakness in herself or her allies, and she is vehement that the only solution to our tadpole problem is to visit the nearest creche to be cleansed. She is, along with another character we'll touch on, a great example of religious trauma. But let's talk more specifically about her background rather than the background of her race. Like I said, Lae'zel is from Creche Kalir, a Gith outpost located in the Tears of Selûne. She tells us that it was here that she witnessed a Kithrak mount a red dragon, and ever since that moment she wanted the same for herself. If we speak with her dead body and ask what her life's dream is, she'll tell us this: ascension, knighthood, silver sword, ride dragon. When she first talks about this ascension, I think it's fair to say that most of us had no idea what that actually meant. Turns out though that ascending is actually just being consumed by Vlaakith to give her more power. Going right back to that religious trauma stuff. Back to her story though, we know that growing up in Creche Kalir was not an easy task. She was constantly forced to prove herself, even fighting her own kin to the death on several occasions. But through all that, she survived. As she says, killing is good. It culls the weak. And our green-skinned friend was absolutely determined to not be weak. So how could she possibly be second to last on this list? Well, there's some important details that I think a lot of people miss in her backstory. Things I certainly missed, but things that shed some light on this specific subject. During her origin intro, Lae'zel tells us that her first step on the path to achieving her dream is to slay a mind flayer and bring its head to her queen. Unfortunately though, we can very confidently say that she failed at this. She elaborates on this point a little later.
A young warrior is expected to fight their first gate with their cousins, kin hatched from the same clutch. The ones who triumph earn a place in Githyanki society. The ones who don't perish.
Are you starting to see the problem with Lae'zel yet? It's not that she failed her mission. I mean, hey, mind flayers are no easy pickings, and the way she describes it, it seems like the Gith usually fight in packs against these things. The problem is that she herself admits that she hasn't yet earned a place in Githyanki society. She is not a fully realized Gith yet. I think it would be fair to compare Lae'zel to some of the youths inside Creche Yelek. These are young Gith who haven't yet proved themselves to their queen Vlaakith. If we take a look at these guys, they're pretty weak. Let's compare her to Youth Astal, another young Githyanki. They both seem to be of the same mindset, as Astal encourages and praises her mentor when he's beating on one of her fellow Gith. Tell me that this doesn't sound exactly like something Lae'zel would say. Savarsh Kethk is a wonderful teacher. When I get my silver sword, Justil, I'll dedicate it to him. Does that not sound exactly like something Lae'zel would say about Voss? The point here is that Lae'zel is comparable to these Githyanki youths, though I'd like to make it clear that I do think she's stronger than them. I mean, she left to go on her mission, and these guys are still training. It's likely that she'd be sitting a level or two higher than them, which puts her around somewhere like level 4 or 5 if we're speaking in terms of raw numbers, but she is definitely beneath some of the other Gith we run into. For example, Sarth Baretha. Sarth isn't her name, it's a title. A leader of a Githyanki squad, but not as high-ranking as someone with the title of Kithrak. Lae'zel is not a Sarth, and I think it's safe to say that she's not as strong as Baretha would be, who when we meet is level 6. Let me reiterate one more time though, that I don't think Lae'zel is weak. She's just young. Younger than the rest of the companions actually. Go ahead, guess how old she is. I would have guessed like early 30s, mid 30s, but Lae'zel is only 22 years old. I'm 25, man. That's crazy. It's not her fault that she's not ranking as high on the list as others, because I absolutely believe she'd climb that ladder if she had the time. But as of now, I think she falls in the 5th place spot. And yeah, I think some people are going to argue that Astarion should be higher than her, but I think we can agree that if poor, rotting, and starved vampire spawn Astarion, and there is no flesh I will not carve and no barrier I will not shatter, with everything to prove Lae'zel were to come to blows, it would certainly go in the Githyanki's favor. Shadowheart was a really hard character to place, because not only does she purposely keep her backstory vague, but she has to keep her backstory vague. The girl doesn't know her backstory. Thankfully, with a little scrounging around, we can fill in some of the gaps. Let's start by talking about where Shadowheart came from. Originally named Genevieve, Shadowheart was once a Selûnite. During an initiation rite though, little Jenny and her parents were stolen away by some Shar worshippers, Shar being the opposing goddess to Selûne. Shadowheart would have her memories taken from from her and tampered with. She forgot that it was her father that tried to save her that night because the memory was replaced with a wolf attacking her instead. That led her to believe that the Sharans were saving her, and through this lens, she would grow up and train inside of the Cloister of Somber Embrace in Baldur's Gate. In this place, Shadowheart was put through the ringer by her mother superior, Viconia de Veer. She's not her actual mom though, that's just a title. Anyways, Shadowheart would be forced to learn the tenets and ideals of Sharan worship. She would come to believe that loss was part of her goddess's way of showing love, and this is where the idea of religious trauma comes back into play. There was something special about Shadowheart though, something Viconia writes about in a book hidden away inside of the cloister. She writes, so often her behavior makes a mockery of the name she has adopted, Shadowheart. That Lady Shar believes that she shall one day become the perfect embodiment of her will makes my gorge rise. Have I not proven myself worthy? I will not give up. I will remake her, or I will break her. Viconia admits here that Lady Shar sees something special in Shadowheart, and that says a lot. Not only is being noticed by the god you worship something spectacular, but Shar is obviously communicating with Viconia somehow, and goes as far as to tell Viconia that Shadowheart may one day become the perfect embodiment of her will. Shar is frankly a dick, so her saying something like that is high praise. Now, as the last bit of that little book I just read to you goes to show, Viconia is not happy about this. She's extremely jealous of the young girl and seeks to break her will. She is constantly exposing the poor kid to the mirror of loss, making her forget literally everything she knows, and worst of all, is forcing Shadowheart to practice her new skills on her own parents. Shart doesn't know who they are, but the torment they must have experienced, watching their daughter be molded into a brainwashed pawn for their opposing goddess. Though, even while going through all of this, Viconia would forbid Shadowheart from becoming a Dark Justiciar. A Dark Justiciar is a rank a Sharan can achieve that proves that they have become exactly what the Lady of Lost desires. I definitely don't think that she wasn't able to become one though because of her lack of ability. It was most certainly because her mother superior was just being spiteful. Something I never quite realized about Shadowheart's background though is that the training didn't go on for just a few years. For a few decades even. I thought Shadowheart was like 26. That would have been my guess. But that girl is 48 damn years old. She would spend all of these years undergoing this aforementioned training, having her brain tampered with, until one day, Shadowheart was selected for a mission. When the Absolute began its rise to power, word soon reached the Mother Superior's ears, and she was determined to put a stop to it. You see, the Sharans had recently captured a Githyanki scout and tortured some information out of him. This information led them to the whereabouts of the mysterious artifact that we become ever so familiar with in our playthrough. Shadowheart doesn't get to know what the artifact does. All she knows is that it's on her and her allies to retrieve it and bring it back to Baldur's Gate. No questions asked, no hesitation allowed. Now, this is where I kind of want to start explaining why Shadowheart is above Astarion and Lae'zel. I mean, I think most people assumed Lae'zel would have been above Shart, considering our fellow companions seem shocked when Shadowheart kills Lae'zel during their little confrontation over the artifact. Like I mentioned, Shadowheart is special, not just because the Mother Superior is jealous of her, but because her own goddess has acknowledged her and said that she may become something great. That's some points in her favor right there. Then, she's selected for this super special mission. I'm a little torn though. Did Viconia pick Shadowheart in hopes that she would fail and die on the mission, or did she pick her because she was the best option? Well, written in the Artifact Mission Agent roster, we see 5 names. Calden Darkwood, the leader, Budug Vriss, the close combat expert, Kirk Deepcroft, the lockpicker, Drina Koval, the languages specialist, and of course, Shadowheart, the healer. What's more important than these names is what's written before them. Above their names, it is noted that this group has proven themselves to be the most skilled and have the greatest chance of successfully obtaining the artifact. Though, it does go on to say that they remain utterly expendable. I feel like that just kinda isn't true, right? I mean, like, this mission is obviously important. They wouldn't just pick a bunch of random people to go on it. What this more likely means to me is that these are the most capable people that haven't yet become Dark Justiciars. As we know, Shadowheart is the sole survivor of this mission, and we also know that to get the artifact, she and her companions went all the way, infiltrating the Githyanki outpost. Now, this means a few things. One, Shadowheart is a dog. We see just how tough some Githyanki are, and to imagine imagine that she got in and out with the artifact in tow is kind of unreal. She is a cleric of the trickery domain, so it may be less about how strong she is and more about how skilled she is, but frankly, I don't really see the difference in this case. If you can make it through a crash while them folks are nipping at your heels, you're something special. And 2, Shadowheart is a terrible fucking healer. I mean, come on, the healer isn't supposed to be the one to survive, man, that's crazy. All that to say, Shadowheart, to me, has proven to be more than meets the eye, and I think she earns the spot above Astarion and Lae'zel in 4th place. Okay, folks, it's time for a leap of astronomical proportions in terms of strength because the next 3 companions are all much tougher than the former, and we're going to talk about them for longer. I think I can confidently say that the next 3 would each solo the bottom 3. The question begs then, what order would they go in? Well, though I do think 2 of them are arguably equals, I'd say that Karlach suits the 3rd spot a bit better. Karlach has a lot going for her in terms of strength, but let's break down her history a little bit so that we can better understand the things she's been through that have led her to being as strong as she is. Karlach was a little, in her own words, delinquent growing up. She didn't seem to have much direction in life until a friend of hers introduced her to a very familiar name to those who have played Baldur's Gate 3, Gortash. Gortash was looking for some muscle, and Karlach was more than willing to oblige. Karlach tells us that she enjoyed working for Gortash, and she enjoyed even just being with him. Not in a crush sort of way though, she's very clear about that. Things sound pretty good for Karlach at this point, right? Well, yeah, they were. So that's why when it all came crashing down around her, Karlach was absolutely lost. You see, Gortash is, for a lack of a better term, a piece of shit. Proving that point, Gortash made a deal with the Archdevil of Hell itself, Zariel, to trade Karlach for, we don't even know. Seriously, we never get to know, in actual uncertain terms, what Gortash got in return for betraying Karlach. Unless I missed something, of course. Lots of folks online assume that Gortash traded Karlach for help to gain access to Mephistopheles' vault, but that's just not the case. We know that Helsike helped Gortash and the Dark Urge with that task. I think it's more likely that Gortash was given some sort of infernal metal to help craft his Steel Watchers, and of course his magnum opus, the Hellfire Watcher Titan. Or it's a more boring answer like money, because Karlach does tell us that Gortash was paid well for Karlach's services. Regardless of the why, the deal was done and Karlach was brought down to Avernus before she even knew what hit her. It was here that Karlach would become part of a terrible experiment. We don't know why Gortash was willing to get rid of her, but we know that Zariel was looking for someone she could test something on. She would take poor young Karlach and remove her literal heart. In its place, Zariel would put in an infernal machine. This machine wouldn't just torque Karlach up emotionally, but more importantly, in Zariel's eyes, it made her physically stronger. With this terrible experiment proving successful, Zariel would then send Karlach off to fight for her in the Blood War of Avernus. In simple terms, the Blood War is kind of like a huge battle between demons and devils. Demons are a more chaotic force hailing from the abyss and wield terrible, powerful abilities, physical or otherwise. Devils are on the other, generally a little more intelligent side of the Hellspawn coin. This is an oversimplification of the Blood War, and I could probably make a whole video about that thing, but just know that Karlach was not only forced to fight in it, but she was good at it. That infernal heart of hers really helped keep her fierce, and the overwhelming lust for revenge kept her determined. Karlach fought in this war for 10 whole years, with very little rest and absolutely no relaxation. She didn't see a way out, until the answer to her prayers came careening out of the sky. The Nautiloid, the very same ship we find ourselves on at the start of the game, enters Avernus briefly while trying to flee the pursuing Githyanki. Now, the timing of this event is a little confusing for me because it seems like Karlach didn't decide to break away until the Nautiloid appeared, but we know that Wyll was chasing Karlach for some time. She herself says he's been hunting her for ages, but if that's true, then Karlach must have gone rogue before the Nautiloid, because why else would Wyll be hunting her? Yeah, anyways, Karlach sees the Nautiloid as her ticket out of Avernus, and with Wyll hot on her heels, she climbs aboard the ship. That's of course where her Baldur's Gate 3 journey begins, and where my background context rant ends. I know that was a lot, but there's some very important points in there that go to prove that Karlach isn't your average barbarian. She's something much tougher. First of all, and this isn't really any part of what I just said, but when Karlach wakes up on the ship during her origin playthrough, she's lying next to a dead mind flayer. When she gets up, she remarks that the creature scrambled her brains. So obviously it infected her somehow, but Karlach quickly put the thing down. Soloing an 8th level mind flayer on its own ship nonetheless is a solid feat. Speaking of feats, this, we need to talk about just how impressive it is that Karlach managed to survive 10 years of the Blood War. And not only did she survive, like I mentioned previously, she thrived. Well, okay, she wasn't happy, but she did really well. So well that, as Karlach phrases it, Zariel made Karlach her personal attack dog. Let's sit on that for a second. The Archdevil of Avernus, Zariel, chose Karlach as her favorite puppet. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean Karlach was the strongest. She also tells us this at a different point in the game. In the grand scheme of things, I'm inconsequential to Zariel. Sure, I've got the engine, but I wasn't even her strongest fighter. But she favored me like a child favors a captive pet. So we know Karlach was really strong, but not the strongest. That's still pretty crazy. We can dive further into how strong Karlach must have been at some point, because we see that after Karlach escapes Avernus, Zariel sends the Paladins of Tyr after her. Now, before, I said Zariel wouldn't want Karlach to die, but what I meant was Zariel wouldn't want anyone to kill Karlach for any reason other than because I said so. The fake Paladins aren't super strong or anything, but the fact that Zariel knew better than to just send one person after her, and instead sent a squad to go get her, just kind of proves that she wasn't anything to sneeze at. Also, just a little detail, not really sure it matters at all, but Karlach survived her heart being replaced by a goddamned machine. Like, hello? And that machine burns so hot that she can't even make physical contact with anyone outside of Avernus because it might just scorch their nuts off. Or lady bits. Whatever, the point is Karlach is, once again, not your average devil. Well, she's not a devil at all. She's a tiefling. But I think you get what I'm saying. As much as Karlach might try to have you assume otherwise, she's not all just fiery rage. She also has a good sense for battle, and has obviously learned some things from her time in Avernus. If you ask her what the best way to kill a devil is, she'll start rattling off all their different weaknesses and ways to defeat them. She also, when she starts really not feeling good, warns you about a weakness you have just in case she's not around to protect you anymore. She is obviously very observant. It's like when Goku starts talking smart when it comes to fighting. She is of that same combat intelligent nature. And you know what? If she doesn't feel like thinking, that's fine, because Karlach has a secret weapon, a power that we really only get to see taken advantage of by her. If she puts a soul coin in her coin hole, she'll unleash the infernal machine's true power. Now, honestly, the buff isn't that significant, but it's pretty clear to us that in strictly lore terms, this ace up her sleeve has gotten her out of some tough situations. I am not done praising Karlach yet. In fact, I want to praise an even younger Karlach. When Gortash and our favorite tiefling started working together, it seems like he was genuinely intent on keeping Karlach around for muscle. It's only when Zariel makes him an offer that he turns on her. At least that's how it looks to me. It doesn't seem to me like he hired her specifically to sell her, just kind of worked out that way. And if that's the case, then Gortash choosing Karlach as his security is huge praise, because that guy isn't stupid. He would only pick someone who was worth their salt, and Karlach obviously was. So take that tough, young girl, give her a robo-devil heart, and put her through literal hell, and you get the Karlach we come to know. Also, Karlach says something fucking crazy. She tells us that she used to hamstring pit fiends for fun. Okay, wow. A, I can only imagine what hamstring means as a verb, and B, that, if true, is an absolutely ridiculous feat of strength. Pit fiends are some of the strongest creatures in all of D&D, with a challenge rating of 20. And yeah, CR isn't reliable, we talked about that, but that's right up there with ancient dragons, man. The only problem with this statement is that we don't ever hear her say anything like this or about this ever again, and the context of the quote is her kind of trying to lighten the mood, so she might have just been saying stuff. Whether that's true or not, it doesn't really matter. Karlach is a powerhouse, and honestly, I think she could be argued for the second spot on this list instead of the third, but regardless of her placing, she is a tough cookie, and someone who you certainly wouldn't want to piss off. In the section about Lae'zel, I talked about how I made a lot of assumptions coming into this video. One of those assumptions was that Wyll was likely going to be the name at the top of this list. That, as we can see, is not the case, because Wyll is falling in at numero 2. Wyll's entry is going to be a little different than the rest, because I'm less arguing why he shouldn't be as high as the rest, like I did with the first 3. I'm pretty much only arguing why I think he's slightly stronger than Karlach. But let's make sure we do the Blade of Frontier some justice, and like like the other companions, talk about where he came from. Wyll is one of the only the two strongest ironically enough, companions with a backstory that doesn't make you want to weep for them. Before he took on the mantle of the Blade, Wyll Ravengard grew up in the city of Baldur's Gate. That last name carried a lot of power because his father was none other than older Ravengard, the Grand Duke. We don't know much about Wyll's mom, Francesca, only that she died just moments after Wyll was born. That didn't seem to impede his life at all though, because Wyll tells us that, as a boy, my bond with my father was too deep to miss the mother I never had, which is kind of beautiful. Wyll would grow older in the city, causing some mischief along the way, and all the while learning 4 tenets of being a good man: courage, insight, strategy, justice. These are the pillars his father lived by, and Wyll was determined to follow suit. He didn't only learn how to become strong mentally, but he also practiced combat with his father, not in the scary murderous way that the poor Githyanki do, but just in a sparring and teaching kind of way. Wyll's life would take a major turn though, when while his father was away from the city, Baldur's Gate was threatened with utter annihilation. Wyll would wake to a whisper in his ear. The whisper told him this: Dusthawk Hill, the Queen of Chaos awakens. Go alone. So Wyll, the heroic 17-year-old he was, took up his rapier and traveled to that location. When he arrived, he found a group of cultists, members of the acclaimed Cult of the Dragon. Even worse, he needed to act quickly because the cult began its terrible ritual and a storm gathered fast. In that storm, a white dragon's head appeared, the first head of Tiamat. If Wyll didn't stop them right then and there, then the summoning of the monstrous dragon goddess would have been successful. In that moment, Wyll heard another whisper, a proposal, an ultimatum. She will destroy Baldur's Gate. Grant me your soul, and I will give you the power to save it. Once again, Wyll, being the young hero he was and still is today, he accepted the deal without hesitation, and entered an infernal warlock pact. With his newfound powers, he slayed the cultists and prevented the ritual from being completed. This pact would come at an unexpected cost though. Not his soul or anything as trivial as that, though it did cost a soul, but it would cost Wyll his relationship with his father. When Wyll's father returned back to the city, his father was disgusted by Mizora's presence. But worse yet, given the terms of Wyll's contract, he couldn't even tell his dad what had happened. He even tried to go and show him the battlefield as evidence, but Mizora quickly proved why working closely with a devil such as herself can be incredibly dangerous. Because when they arrived at the site of that fateful night's events, Mizora had wiped it clean. No trace of the cult, no trace of the battle, and while his young tongue was tied, his father was led to assume the worst. He assumed Wyll took a cheap route to gain power, and the Grand Duke told his son one word: go. A lesser man would have become bitter. A lesser man would have used his new devilish powers to seek revenge. But Wyll was, and is, no lesser man. While hunting one day, Wyll heard cries coming from a nearby farmstead. He rushed to heed the calls, only to find a boy, alongside his dead mother, being swarmed by goblins. Young Ravengard acted swiftly, just like he had against the cult, and saved the boy's life. It was right there that Wyll decided he would take up the title we know so well today, the Blade of Frontiers, and he would do everything in his power to protect the weak and innocent. This, of course, would include hunting dangerous devils, like Karlach? But Karlach's not a dev. Wyll doesn't know that. Like we talked about in the last entry, we know Mizora sent Wyll after Karlach. Wyll was told that Karlach is a danger to the entire Sword Coast, and that she could burn civilization to the ground with just the heat of her rage. And when Wyll made his way to Avernus to take her head, he found just that. Karlach was trying to escape, but in Wyll's eyes, she was a devil, tearing through all creatures in her path, a monster with no regard for life. Or again, so he thought. He chases her onto the Nautiloid, they both end up infected, and then later they come face to face in your camp. This is when we get to tell Wyll that he's being deceived, and that Karlach isn't the beast he was led to believe she was. With Wyll's story laid out, let's talk about why I've concluded that he is the second most powerful companion before the events of Baldur's Gate 3. Like most of the others, Wyll is no stranger to combat. He doesn't go through the forced combat and training like Lae'zel and Shadowheart. He doesn't learn based on a need to survive like Astarion and Karlach, but he instead learns from his caring and loving father, a man who he himself is a force to be reckoned with. In all reality, if the Grand Duke hadn't been away from the city, it may have been him who was called to stop the cultists. Though to be fair, the cultists did take advantage of the fact that he was gone, so it probably couldn't have even happened that way. The point is, Wyll's dad is a tough son of a bitch, and with a guiding and not evil or malicious hand, Wyll became very skilled with the blade. Then, of course, we have to break down the actual battle against the Cult of the Dragon. The average cultist, in D&D terms, is pretty weak. Actually, like, really, really weak. One of the weakest creatures in the whole thing. Their CR CR is 1/8. You only get 25 dang XP for killing these guys. That's rough. Frankly, I think Wyll at that time probably could have taken on 25 of these guys on his own, or at least done enough damage to disrupt the ritual, which leads me to assume that these aren't your average cultists. I mean, think about it. These are cultists that are summoning one of the most evil and dangerous entities in all of Dungeons & Dragons. They almost definitely weren't your run-of-the-mill fodder. And when Wyll gains his new powers, he's still able to kill them all. In fact, Wyll describes it better than I ever could.
I had Mazora at my side, and the archdevil Zariel guided our hands that day. I burned with the fires of Avernus and oozed the rot of Dis. The cultists choked on our poisons and burned from our flames.
Now, I'm gonna go ahead and make yet another assumption and say that when he says he had Mazora at his side, that he's being hyperbolic. Like, she was there offering her powers, and he was using her powers through him, but she wasn't, like, physically the one fighting. Which then, yet another assumption incoming, means that Wyll was smart enough and adaptable enough to get a grasp of these brand new powers, at least enough to take down these cultists. That seems pretty impressive to me, and goes to talk kind of about his combat IQ. Combat IQ, it's like a fucking anime character power scaling, I know. We could also mention his slaying of goblins, but honestly, I'm pretty sure you or I could kill a goblin or two. So what on Toril makes me think that Wyll deserves to be number 2? Well, it might sound insane, but I can sum it up in one word: confidence. Wyll isn't stupid, he isn't careless, and I'd hesitate to even call him reckless. He is, though, very confident in most things. One of the most important things we hear him say, again very confidently, is that if Karlach tried to take his head, then she would have died in the attempt. It's witty banter, for sure, and probably shouldn't be taken that seriously, but the way he says it, it's almost kinda scary. Like, he smiles and scoffs at the idea that Karlach could take his head, and then he just says she would have died. When Wyll gets serious, I get nervous. That's just a tiny example though, and is circumstantial evidence at best in the case of Wyll being stronger than Karlach. And, you know, while we're on the, it seems like Dumpy is wrong train, let's talk about the Blade of Frontier's strongest foe. Listen to this little exchange that Wyll and Shadowheart have.
So, Wyll, what was the Blade of Frontier's toughest kill?
It was a great scrap. A hungry minotaur with a hankering for human flesh. An axe-bearing mountain of fur she was. Gave me a nasty scar.
Wyll admits here that a Minotaur was his most difficult battle. That's kinda silly, considering a Minotaur is a monster with a challenge rating of 3, and we also tear through some of them in the Underdark like they're made of paper. But like with Astarion and the vampire spawn situation, there are obviously exceptions. If this monster was able to harm, no, even scar Wyll, then I have no doubt that it was a sight to behold, because we haven't mentioned some of the other very interesting quotes from our hero yet. Wyll says in passing that before the Tadpole, he used to tussle with hill giants without breaking a sweat. Now, is this absolutely 100% true? No, probably not. But I don't think he'd outright lie. There must be some sort of fact behind this. If Wyll was even able to slay a hill giant by himself, whether he broke a sweat or not, then that would make him look pretty good, because Karlach tells us that she's always wanted to square up against a hill giant, and that with the two of you being the player, you might even stand a chance. Now again, is this her being totally literal? Probably not. I'd put my money on Karlach taking the win against a hill giant for sure. The difference between the two is that one word again: confidence. Karlach has survived some insane things, but Wyll makes me believe that he could survive anything. He would slay any monster, defeat any foe, and conquer any battlefield because it's what he does. He's the Blade of Frontiers. This is all without even mentioning some of the more ridiculous things that Wyll says. For instance, when you see Kudanos outside of the mountain pass, Wyll makes this remark: "I tangled with a dragon once. Never forgot it." That's what he says when he sees a dragon. He's not afraid at all. So he's either telling us that he fought a whole ass dragon and lived to tell the tale, or he's referencing that night against Tiamat. Sure, surviving an encounter with a dragon would be impressive, but if he's talking about Tiamat, which I'd assume is what he's getting at here, then that means he may have actually had to contend with her during the battle against the cultists in some way. Even if Wyll managed to fend off that one single head of the dragon goddess like he described, that is an out of this world feat. But let's get a little more meta now, and maybe even cheat a little bit in Wyll's favor. If you manage to successfully break Wyll's pact with Mazora, then after you defeat the Elder Brain, Wyll will lose his warlock powers. Whether he goes to Avernus and becomes the Blade of Avernus, or continues on in Faerun, Wyll will tell you something pretty crazy.
I will be hunting Mazora. I won't let her claim one more soul, slay one more victim. I'm going to make my way to the Hells and tear the horns right off her damned head. I'll cut her to ribbons before she can so much as groan Zariel's name.
1, that's really cool. And 2, Wyll, without his warlock powers, is confident that he can take Mizora. And you know what? Again, with that theme of confidence, I completely believe him. I don't doubt him for a second. And hey, if Wyll does end up traveling to the Hells, then he has a pretty damn good time down there without Mizora's help. Talking about it like a kid would talk about a field trip. This guy is a monster. He doesn't even seem to need his pact. And the final thing I want to mention, again, touching on that single word, confidence, Karlach says 2 things about Wyll that kinda seal the deal for him being above her, even if just slightly. The man's got a reputation for being lethal with that blade. I'm glad he's on our side. And gut him, I'd rather toast him. He could have gone for my throat. Keep in mind that Karlach is saying these things during our playthrough, when they've both been weakened. She still respects and reveres Wyll's strength. And you know why? Because of that damn confidence. Wyll is a character after my own heart, and I feel great about placing him at number 2. Be honest with me, when this video started, did you know Gale was going to be at the top? Like I said a few times now, I assumed it would be Wyll, but the most powerful of Baldur's Gate 3's companions was staring me in the face the entire time. It is certainly, unequivocally, and without a single doubt in my mind,
Gale of Waterdeep.
We know a decent amount of fun facts about Gale, and every single one of those facts proves to me that Gale's former strength is unparalleled in comparison to his peers. First of all, elephant in the room, the guy is carrying a nuke. There, let's get that out there. Gale carries a fragment of the Karsite weave within his body, and if he so chooses, he can pop that bad boy and bring everything within a 100-mile radius down with him. I made that detail up. I don't know what the radius is, but the blast zone is huge. Now, there are 2 things I'm expecting to hear in response to that. Well, if Gale uses the orb, then he dies too. And that's absolutely true, but he's definitely killing whatever he aimed that thing at. And the other argument will be that Gale can't detonate the orb on command before Elminster gives him the ability to do so during our playthrough. And to that, I say, yes, he can. Gale tells us that if he dies and stays dead, the orb will go boom. He knows that full well. So, simple solution for him, just end your life and end the life of everything around you as well. The orb thing isn't really a point in his favor, it's just something that I think we'd be silly not to talk about. Gale doesn't really need the orb in his corner to prove how insanely powerful he was, because there's a large plot element that pretty much slaps us in the face a few times with that truth. Gale was Mystra's lover. Not just her chosen, not just her student, not just her disciple. The man was her fucking lover. Oh, Mystra, by the way, is the goddess of magic. When Karsus destroyed Mistral, the weave and all magic went with her. But then Mystra came back, reborn, vacuumed up the place, and what do you know? We've got magic again. She is literally the embodiment of all things magical. And so the fact that Gale was, pardon my French, making that shit clap is utterly insane. Something Gale says almost in passing, as if it's no big deal, is that Mystra showed him the secrets beneath the veil. He's talking about magic, not just her naked body. This would give Gale an advantage, or maybe just an understanding when it comes to magic that very few, if really any, other people in the entire realm have. But okay, why exactly would Mystra become so interested in Gale? Well, it's because someone else became interested in Gale first. Another very impressive person, Elminster. Elminster Almar is one of the strongest wizards in the Forgotten Realms universe. Barring maybe someone like Karsus who sought to ascend to godhood, Elminster is definitely up there. In fact, he is one of Mystra's chosen. And so, when Elminster, as Gale describes, plucked Gale from obscurity and offered his guidance and faith, Gale began learning from a master. And that would absolutely pay off. If you speak with Gale's dead body and ask him what his profession is, he'll say one of 2 things. If he's in your party, he'll answer with wizard, archmage, companion. If he hasn't actually been recruited yet, then he'll instead tell you wizard, archmage, wielder of the weave. Regardless of which option you hear, there's a word in there that should set your brain ablaze. Archmage. Going back to those ever so unreliable D&D stats, an archmage is a wizard, or maybe a sorcerer too, I don't know if sorcerers can be archmages, that is capable of casting 9th level spells. And, pardon me, I must have forgotten. What's the highest level of spell that exists in D&D? Oh, right, the 9th level. To even cast those kinds of spells, a player character would have to be at least level 17, and you can only go up to 20. Elminster, at least in his Baldur's Gate 3 appearance, which isn't actually Elminster, it's a simulacrum, is level 20. That puts Gale just 3 levels at most away from one of the all-time goats of wizardry. Big 3 old man wizards: Dumbledore, Gandalf, Elminster. Now yes, I'm really sucking our boy's balls here, but that's because the man has earned it. When we ask Gale about himself, he tells us that he's a wizard of considerable acclaim and scholar of exceptional accomplishment. The first time I heard that, and I think like most others, I was like, yeah, okay man, whatever. But with just a little critical thinking and using my listening ears, I completely understand why Gale is so, I don't know, kinda arrogant. He's confident like Wyll, but in a bit more of a condescending way. But dude, how could he not be? He's laid with a goddess. He's seen magic through a lens that very few others, if any, ever have or could even understand. Gale may talk big, but he's absolutely walking that walk. But okay, let's argue against Gale now, because I think it's only fair. I've done that with pretty much everyone else at this point. The only thing I can think that holds Gale back from being as great as he could be is that trump card in his back pocket, or like breast pocket, probably. I'm talking about the bomb. The orb is sapping Gale's magical energy at an ever-increasing rate, as we witness by not only him telling us this, but by his unique status ailment, Arcane Hunger. If Gale doesn't consume magical artifacts in a timely enough manner, then he'll grow physically weaker. The funny thing though, is that this disadvantage doesn't really affect his magical ability. All it does is give him disadvantage on Constitution saving throws. Like at absolute worst, you could say that maybe he'll have a harder time maintaining concentration, but man, you don't need concentration to disintegrate a person. And in the same manner that I kinda cheated with Wyll, let's talk about what happens near the end of Gale's journey. Throughout the game, you can uncover details about something called the Crown of Karsus, a remnant of that plan of Karsus's to become a god. After seeing that crown for himself and reading the book The Annals of Karsus, Gale gets a bright idea. He'll use the crown to ascend to godhood. That couldn't possibly go wrong, right? Well, it doesn't. Gale is able to use the crown. Gale is able to become the god of ambition, and Gale is able to succeed where Karsus failed. Now, again, we're cheating, but even without all those details, it's pretty clear that Gale is a total anomaly when it comes to human intelligence. The guy is smart beyond his years, only being in like his early 30s, and that intelligence is why I think Gale sits alone at the top of this list. I love Baldur's Gate 3. I really do. It's my favorite game, straight up. It's taken root in my brain in a way that very few other games ever have, and I don't plan on chopping it down anytime soon. If you had fun watching this video, that makes me very happy. I had a lot of fun writing and studying these characters, so hopefully I didn't get too crazy. I get a little excited sometimes. If you did make it this far, you can let me know by leaving a comment that says this: well, obviously Boo is the strongest, because you know what? He is. He is the strongest. If you guys have similar ideas to this video, let me know. I'd like to hear it. Thank you guys again for watching. Be sure to tell me what I got wrong. I'm sure you will. And I hope I'll see you in the next one. GG's, everybody.